Time no see. Marc Daniel Nelson here with Make My Music on this excruciatingly hot Labor Day weekend in Southern California. I'm here today to give you my favorite 4 top drum plugins. This is a great track by Jonathan Greig called Lonely Exile. Number 1. Usually when I'm doing any kind of drum augmentation, like triggers or anything like that, I don't just completely wipe out and replace the drum. I like to use the original drum. Let's say it's a snare. I use the original snare, and then I choose a snare that sounds similar to it, or I use something specific in that sample, either a transient thing or a low thumpy thing or something about it that I'm augmenting the original snare. But what happens is when you put the two together in line, sometimes the trigger, depending on what trigger app you use, is not 1,000,000% in phase based on that very first transient. So what I decide to do is either I choose the snare sample or the actual snare as the main first transient hit. Once I decide that, I will use a transient designer or something in that nature to tuck down that very first hit. If I think, okay, I'm using a snare sample to get that first hit, then I would tuck down the original snare. This will allow me to keep the snare in phase, or the kick in phase, or the tom or whatever you're using to augment in phase, and have the entire punch from the sample. On the kick drum here, if I play the kick by itself, it's really, really nice sounding kick drum. But inside the track, I feel like it could use a little more body. So I use this as my sample augment. All this is really doing is ambience when you combine the two. But what happens is, if it didn't have this transient designer or this transient shaper by, Soft Tube, it would get a little mucky when you put the two together, because one would be fighting over the other for that first attack sound. So if I take it out, it goes. They both have kind of an attack thing. By putting this transient in, it slices off that first hit. And it allows the room to build up in a beautiful way. On the snare, I actually did something opposite. On the sample, I liked the attack, the punch, the power of the hit. And then on the snare itself, I took a little bit out using the spiff, more frequency-based transient shaper. Instead of boosting, I cut it. So it took a specific area out between 1 and 5K, just enough that it let the sample stick through. So without it, together, here's the snare. And then here's it with the spiff on. You get all that really great, beautiful 140, 130 hertz kind of pump from that very first transient. Combined, you get this. Let's take out the transient on the kick sample. You lose all the focus. Back in. Let's take the spiff out of the snare. Number 2, I like to mix and automate the samples depending on what the actual drum is doing. So reference is if it's a tom track or a snare track. What happens is, we all know when you put a snare on a roll, it starts sounding like a shotgun. It just sounds terrible. Regardless of if it's supposed to be a sample or not, it just sounds like crap. What I like to do, on any time I use a snare sample or a kick sample or any kind of augment sample on a drum set, anytime it rolls and stuff, I actually back out of the mix, automated wise. So I set up my automation in the trigger program. And then I have an access point where I can do automations based around the rolls. Let's find one roll that's specific and take it out and hear what it sounds like. This is without. Even bringing down the detail, it just sounds very fake. By automating, just after the first hit, you get something like this. This gives us full control of the original snare when we need it, which even if it's not the greatest sounding snare, it will still be as beautiful and as detailed as you can get on the rolls. So you can get your very first sample in there and the very last sample in there, and what's in between is just the perfection of the real snare. Number 3, my overheads. Most of the time in digital, regardless of if you're using killer gear or average gear, good converters, bad converters, you're gonna get really sharp and sometimes a little over aggressive cymbals. Sometimes the player is hitting too hard. Sometimes the room is responding too much for the cymbals. And let's be honest, sometimes it's just crappy sounding cymbals. Now, one of my favorite parts of tape is what it does to cymbals. And it's not necessarily about compression. It's just about taking off this really aggressive aliasing, or I don't even know how to explain, but digital does not do very well with cymbals. No matter what, even the beautiful sounding stuff, it still sounds aggressive and abrasive. I like to pull out the Soothe plugin specifically for this, because what it allows me to do again is to hyper focus on the area that I feel like is bad. Let's be realistic. It is kind of voodoo. So whatever it's doing, it's seeming to help it. And I have it here between 4 and 8. I set it up on hard because I feel like the hard at a fast attack just keeps things bright, but not so abrasive. Now when I put it back in, here's out. You can really hear it in the hi-hat. Now this track didn't have a hi-hat track, so I wanted to keep the groove going, but not make things too dark. That's in. The sharpness is a little higher than halfway, and my selectivity down a little bit. Now if I pull the sharpness up, it just becomes a little too flicky. If I take it down, it comes a little slow. I feel like that's a good starting place. And out with the full kit. And then back in. 5% rule here, but it does help. It really does. When you start collecting everything and have acoustic guitars and vocals and everything that is fighting that high frequency, this keeps everything tucked in. Number 4, and my final trick for today, is my drum bus compressor. I am a huge fan of the 1178 on drums, specifically because of what it does to the transients and stuff. The speed, it just sounds different than a normal 1176. Now, having this engaged without the sidechain, it does something that I actually don't like. And what it's doing is it's clamping down on all the low sub stuff in the drum set. The kick drum, if it's a floor tom, stuff like that. It's not about the compression that I don't like. It's about how it's just sucking out all this beautiful stuff that's under, I don't know, 60 hertz or something. So if we listen to it without, I'm going to keep the compression in, but the sidechain is off. It's very lightly tapping, but listen to the kick drum when I engage it. You hear the kick drum blooming? the way it does things, it just keeps things in rhythm. Not to say that that's a joke or anything, but it just keeps things really tight. It lets the kick drum breathe. It lets the bass come in once we put the whole kit inside. So if we listen to the drums and bass of this track. Out. In. Beautiful. Well, that's it in a nutshell. Thanks again for watching. Enjoy your mixing for this week or two. Stay in the air conditioning if you can. Get in the water if you can. Jump in the pool. Jump in the lake. Stay cool. And let's all have a great fall. Take it easy.